Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters, and welcome to this week's live chat where we're going to talk about machine quilting. I have some fun little quilting demo in store for you, a couple of announcements, kind of give you an idea of what's going to happen the next couple of weeks. It's going to be a great time. I hope that you're doing well since our last live chat, and if you are watching live, be sure to put your questions in the chat because Jessica's back, yay! And she's monitoring that, and she'll shoot them over to me at the end so I can answer your questions live. In this week's live chat, I'm actually going to do a little bit of quilting. It's something I don't normally do, but I already had everything set up for an online class I taught earlier today, so I thought, well, we're just going to roll with that. So we're going to talk about the Woodgrain design. I'm going to show some variations. There were a couple questions that came up in the type chat before we started, so I'll be sure to hit those. And then, like I said, Jessica will definitely let me know if we have any questions to answer live. Before we get to that, though, just want to go over some announcements, just some upcoming things to keep in the back of your mind. I've got some other stuff coming up, but these are just a couple I could talk about right now. The Quilt Walk is next year, June 8th. You might be thinking, well, dang, we just got out of, well, not really even out of summer. It's not quite out of summer yet, almost. But you might want to go ahead and save that date because Jenny Doan is going to be our featured guest. So we're super excited about that here at Quilting is My Therapy, located just outside of Kansas City. So like if you've been wanting to see her, this is the time to do it. And then as a bonus, we're only 30 minutes from Missouri Star Quilt Company. Well, probably more like 45. And so you can always pop in and see them too. So there'll be more details coming up, more things about that, of course, as we go through the days. But I just want to give you a heads up on that so you can make some plans. If you don't live in the area, you might have to work your way, this way. If not, either way. All right. And then next week, I'll be back with next week's live chat. I'm going to go over Build a Quilt. Sorry, I kind of skipped ahead. Got too excited there. Next week's live chat, I'm going to be talking about our Build a Quilt Block of the Month program. This is something that only opens up once a year. It's something we do exclusively here at Quilting is My Therapy, all the fabric, all the blocks. So I'm going to show that off, kind of a big reveal. But I'll also talk a little bit about what goes into designing fabric. So if you've always kind of had a question about that or curious what that looks like, because for our Block of the Month program, I designed 3 full fabric collections so that you can have your pick. But we'll learn more about that next week. And then I'm looking ahead at the schedule. I've got some topics to cover. I'm hoping mid-November, beginning of November, to be able to announce our next Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along, our next video series. I know we're all excited to hear all about that, and so we'll definitely, I'll definitely keep you updated. All right, that's it for the announcements. Of course, you can always check out quiltingismytherapy.com for all that information. And you can see I have my machine set up for quilting, and the Woodgrain Design is one that we have seen before. We have done it in videos, but it's a really fun one to quilt, but it's also one of those that benefits if you can watch it develop a little bit. So let me do a couple steps and then I'll talk through it. So once I start quilting, I'm just quilting that nice, gentle, wavy line from one side to the next. Whether that's the whole quilt, whether it's just an area, just doesn't matter. I'm just going to go from one edge to the next. Now, once I have that shape, and I know you can't see it quite yet, but just wait for it. We're going to get to that. Once I have that first wavy line, my whole design builds off of that. I'm going to do some echoing. So with echoing, I'm quilting that same shape just a set distance apart. So I'm going to travel along the edge of my area just a bit and then start echoing that line. Now, echoing is one of those things that can be tricky when you're starting out. So I'm just looking ahead of the needle in the direction I'm heading. So here's my first line. There is my echo line. I'm kind of putting my eye behind here so that I can start making adjustments as I'm quilting. I would much rather have this line smooth than perfect. So I'm not overthinking it. I'm just trying to keep that nice momentum, and I'm going all the way back to the other side, just kind of building up this line. One of the biggest things, or one of the best habits I can give you is if you're learning, if you haven't been quilting a long time, then let's go ahead and get this good habit in. You have the most control when you have your hands on either side of the needle. So as we're doing those long wavy lines, once my hands are not beside my needle anymore, I need to stop the machine, move my hands, and then continue on. That's really going to help give me control when it comes to this wavy line. See, so far so good, right? No big deal. Just some wavy lines, some nice little echoes. And I'm going to keep doing that, except if I want to get that wood grain effect, I want to add some knots or just some different shapes just to give it a little bit of texture. So I'm going to continue echoing. But at a random point, I'm going to say, you know, I'm going to stop my echo line and I'm going to quilt this line that arcs out and echo inside of it. So just kind of pausing, adding that knot kind of shape just to give it a little bit of texture and then moving on. So from this point, I'm going to go back out towards the top, kind of making like almost a pod. So you can kind of see there it comes to a point. It's wider in the center. It doesn't have to be symmetrical. It can be curvier, less curvier. I don't care. I just want it to come out away from those wavy lines. So I have my little knot and then I can fill that in. Now what you fill it in with depends on what you want to quilt, but I'm going to do the classic wood grain real quick and I'm going to do some echo lines. So I'm just going to echo my way inside and then back on out. And there we can see that first little knot right there. Now it's funny because when I'm demoing this or I'm teaching it, I'm so precise, I take my time. But when I'm actually quilting it, I go pretty fast and I might not have my points as sharp right here. But as long as I have that nice texture, that change of direction, it's going to be fine. But once I'm done with that knot, I'm going to echo around and go right back into quilting my wavy lines. So just kind of like, all right, enough of that. And back to echoing. Don't forget, reposition your hands. You're going to see really quickly what my bad habit is, not doing that. And then keep going. So let's do that again. We're going to travel, add some echoing. And I decided to go ahead and add a knot right there. So swooping out away from the direction I was just going, so I have that nice round center. Again, it doesn't have to be any particular size. It doesn't have to be any particular shape. I just want to create that different spacing so I can then echo it in and then echo my way back out. And we can see a couple of those starting to build up. What's really nice about the wood grain design is once you get the hang of it, it goes really quickly. Now you might, in the beginning, you might think, I don't believe you, Angela, that's not the case, but it really does. And depending on your preferences or how you like to quilt this design, you might have more of those knots. Your wood grain might be knottier, or you might have less. It's totally fine. There's no wrong or right way to do this design. It's just gonna give you that nice, beautiful texture. So let me add a few more lines so we can see what that looks like. And then some common troubleshooting things, because if you've tried this design, you might have struggled with a couple things, and hopefully I can help you with that. Again, don't forget to reposition the hands. Okay, the most important thing about this design, or the biggest struggle I think that most quilters have, is that we tend to not fill in that space as completely as possible. What that means is as I'm adding my knots and as I'm adding my wavy lines, I want to make sure I don't have any gaps or any unquilted areas. I want it all to be nice and filled in. So I have to be comfortable with filling in those gaps as they come. Let me show you what I mean. So here I have a nice big pod, just like we talked about. But let's say I come in and work my way out and I have all these gaps around it, which is common, not a problem. So we can kind of see I have a little bit of an uneven spacing there, a little bit thicker, a little bit thinner. It's fine. I mean, if you do it once, you'll probably do it again, so it's going to be fine. But what I want to do is any of these little gaps, I want to fill them in while I'm there. If you don't catch it in time, that's not the end of the world. You can always come back and do it. But I just want to make sure I use any echoing, any filler to just handle those while I'm there. So as I come around, if I need to go back in here and just add a little bit of an echo line to get back on track, that's totally fine. So just as you're going, if you have any huge areas, just add some more lines, add some more pods. Quilt Angela is awesome in there. It doesn't matter, just fill it in. It's gonna look good. So as you see those areas start to show up, just go ahead and fill them in. Now, as you're quilting your wood grain design, and as you're working through any design, you might already be comfortable with this design. You're thinking, I don't really need to watch this. As you're working with any design, you can change up the way it looks and create variations, but you also don't have to worry about what size your individual elements are. Okay, what does that even mean? Like if I'm quilting swirls or wood grains, it's not the size of that initial shape that will determine the density, it's the spacing between those lines. So if I want this to be, more dense, I'll quilt the lines about 1/4 inch apart like I'm doing here. But if I'm doing this over the whole quilt, or I want a nice subtle overall texture, you can do them 1/2 inch or even 1 inch apart. So it's that spacing between the lines is what I'm really paying attention to. Not necessarily the size of that first knot or that first arc. Notice this one's a little bit smaller than this one over here. It's all right because the spacing between the lines will be the same. Now when I'm quilting this on a sewing machine, I tend to work, like I said, in a vertical motion. However, on a long arm, I might quilt this more horizontally. Well, I would quilt this more horizontally on a long arm just because it's a little bit easier that way. So as you're learning this design, or any design, try to play around different directions and see which one feels a little bit more comfortable, and that's probably the direction you should go with. So another example of a big unquilted area came out. I have that little gap right there, so I'm going to handle it while I'm there. Add some echo lines, another knot, whatever I need to do before I move on. With this design, the struggle that most quilters have is they'll quilt a few rows of it, they'll think it doesn't look good, they'll get frustrated and give up. But really, you can't judge the design just on a little bit of quilting. You have to keep going and keep filling in that area until you can see that whole beautiful look. I promise, you just keep adding that nice texture, it's going to look great. And when I'm filming or I'm doing this live chat, I'm using contrasting threads so you can really see what I'm doing. However, if you're quilting this design on an actual quilt, you're probably not going to want to use that contrasting thread because we don't want to see every little bit and bobble. We just want to have that nice overall texture. So that will also help cover any quilting sins. All right, let's talk about some variations. Let me add another couple of lines here. Maybe another little knot. And again, if I have any of those gaps, any weird little areas, I'm going to go ahead and fill them in while I'm there. Now when it comes to the wood grain design, for some reason, this shape, I'm going to see if I can get that flat for you, this little knotty kind of shape can be tricky for some quilters, and I think it has to do with the symmetrical look of it. If you're struggling with echoing your way in and out, or you're just not loving the look of that design, there's another variation you can do that will combine a little bit of free motion quilting and those pods for a different effect. And this is a great design if you need something just a little bit different for your quilts. So it's going to start out the same way. I'm still going to do my wavy line. I'm still going to quilt my pod or my shape that is wider in the middle and pointier at the ends. Except this time, I'm going to go ahead and run it all the way into itself. So that line is actually closed off. It looks like a pointy kind of lasso, right? Goes out to a point, comes back, and runs into that main line. And what that's going to give me is this unquilted area that I can then fill in with a different design. I could put a different filler in here if I wanted to. If I was wanting to show off because it was for a live chat and I wanted you to be impressed with it, I could do something like wishbones or swirls, depending on how much room I have. And I'm just going to work my way, filling in that pod to the opposite side. All right, so I have my little chunk, I fill it in, and I move to the other side. Really, it doesn't matter what you put in there, just as long as you get to the other side, because we're going to keep going and adding more of these to create our shape, to create our design. Of course, on a sewing machine, I'm constantly repositioning the quilt, constantly making sure it's up, not getting any drag on it. There's another little pod. If I'm not really feeling the filler, but I want to practice that, I can just add maybe a wavy line in between, like a little leaf shape almost, and then move on to the other side. what's pretty fun about this is all the shapes are the same, right? Or all the variations start with the same basic shape. So as you're quilting, you can mix and match in between your regular wood grain, in between the variations. You can just say, forget it, I'm going in back to just the wavy lines. I'm just gonna do them wavy lines all over the area. That's fine too. Again, the most important thing is I just wanna make sure I fill in all the gaps before I move on. I'm so bad about pausing and repositioning my hands. I'm trying to be good. You know, it's the whole like do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. All right, let's do one more of those little kind of pods, little shapes. Maybe I'll do some meandering lines in here. It could be any kind of filler. Go ahead and make those initial pods though a little bit larger. If I'm gonna try cramming some designs in there, I wanna make sure I have enough room for that. So a good couple inches wide will be a nice rule of thumb if you wanna rule. Now, one question that came up, let me get to the end over here, was from Mary Rose, and she said, I want to see how you combine designs, how you go from one to the next, and how you fill in all those areas, or like the gaps that get left behind. Well, that's going to happen, getting those little gaps, right? So if we look right here, I'm touching, we can't see, my design touches down here, but I have this big gap in up here. So I'm going to fill that in with just some wavy lines, just make sure everything is filled in. And then if I find myself stuck and unable to get back out, then I'll just travel along the edge of the block to get me to that point. Of course, you could break thread too, that's fine. You know, tie off and start a new line of quilting. It's just totally up to you. So I'm just gonna add some wavy lines to fill this in. And then once I have that whole area filled in, I'm just gonna go back, make sure there's no big gaps, since that will be the most noticeable. If there was something really large that I didn't love, I could add some more quilting, but really it's that nice overall texture that you're gonna get from filling in that whole area. Now, before I answer any questions that may have come up, it looks like Jessica's writing furiously over there. I will talk about combining designs because that came up with Mary Rose. So as you're working through an area and you're thinking, oh, I love the wood grain, or I'm not loving it, I wanna switch to another one, how do I go from one to the next? Simple as starting the next one. The trick though is I want to make sure I fill in any gaps while I'm there. So I have my wood grain over here. Let's do some swirls. Let's start throwing some designs together just for fun. Ooh, move my pedal a little too close. Get the right spot. All right. So let's say I'm going to transition to a different design. How about some swirls? Once I've quilted a couple of those and I'm like, oh, I'm bored of that, or I'm ready to switch to something else, at that point, I'm just gonna go right into my next design. If I can't fit it in where I'm at, I'll just use echoing to maneuver where I can. So let's pretend I've quilted 3 swirls and now I'm gonna do a leaf, just for funsies. We'll do a leaf to put them in there. There's no rule on how many of each design you have to do. You just kind of have fun with it. So maybe I'll just add a couple leaves. Of course, this could be any design. This is just the design I'm picking. Think of them kind of like letters, right? How all our cursive letters kind of hook into each other. Now I can pause and be like, okay, I'm ready for something different. Maybe I'll do some meandering lines. So beyond that, switching, which can be a little bit tricky as you're learning, I'm also looking for any of the gaps. I have one right behind here, and I'm filling that in before I move on. That's the trickiest part about combining designs, is dealing with the little gaps that come in between, but I can just use echoing to fill it in. I can put a different design in that area. It really doesn't matter as long as it's filled in. Then I can pause and think through, okay, what's the next design I want to do? There's no right or wrong answer. You just go right into it. This is a great way to practice designs that you're not comfortable with. It's a great way to keep me engaged. I'm so easily bored sometimes that it's really nice to have something to switch up. I have a little flower. Isn't it cute? And if I find myself stuck, which is going to happen, right? As we're quilting all these designs, if I find myself stuck, I'm just going to travel along a previous line, maybe add another echo, just scooch on out of there so I can continue on and move on. And just like I said, if I want to add another design but I don't have room for it, or I need to get over here to fill in that gap, I'm going to use echoing to maneuver my way around. Fill in that gap, and then switch to a different design. Now, depending on how adventurous you're feeling, you might do a ton of different designs. You might just alternate between two different designs. Maybe you have a friend that can come in your quilting room and yell out designs to you while you're quilting. That would be kind of scary and fun at the same time. But all the while just pausing and make sure you're filling in all those gaps. Using that echoing to maneuver my way around. The reason I think this works, I mean, I have a lot of different designs right here, but the reason I don't think that it's overwhelming or won't be overwhelming to the quilt is if I'm using a thread color that matches the background of the fabric, it's just going to let me see that texture, and keeping the spacing consistent throughout those lines just gives me that nice overall design. So I don't have like micro quilting next to something else. I just have that just same consistent spacing, just some different designs to throw in some interest and give it a slightly different look. So whether you're starting with your wood grain or you are trying to combine them all together, watch out for those gaps, mind the quilting gaps, and then fill them in. And I promise once you're done, the whole area is filled in, it's going to look great. So any questions come through? The wood grain is really one of those versatile designs I use a lot in a lot of different ways, but it can be tricky when you're getting used to it. When will the next Build a Quilt start? So already excited about that, right? So the Build a Quilt is scheduled to start in November. We will open it up for registration next week, so beginning of October. So very excited. Do I have a built-in stitch regulator on my machine? No. So when I'm quilting on my sewing machine, I'm quilting in manual. Same on my long arm. I don't have a stitch regulator for the sewing machine. That's this consistent stitch length really comes with practice. So if you're frustrated because you're quilting and it's bigger and smaller, just know that it will work itself out there. But no, I'm not using a stitch regulator. And then do I spray baste when I'm going to quilt on a sit-down machine? I don't. I actually like to use the fusible batting that I can use the iron to, kind of fuse it together. That's my preferred, but I do know that some quilters love the spray baste. Some, do the pins. However you hold those suckers together, those layers, just do it, and that way you can have fun with the quilting. So I know this is just a little quick primer, teaser, a little bit of demo, but I really want to take advantage of having the whole setup ready to go. But as you're practicing, promise me that you'll just focus on the gaps, you'll move through that, you'll do the best you can, and when you're done, you'll be proud of the job that you've done. Well, I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. We have a busy week here. Well, personally, my daughter's in homecoming band and all that stuff. It's definitely fall time. It might not be fall season yet, but it feels fall, so I'm excited about that. But I will see you all next Thursday at 3 p.m., and I will have some giveaways and the Build a Quilt, and it'll be a really fun time. Until then, everybody, happy quilting.